Thanks everybody for attending this side event. It's co-hosted by the UK with Astra Anti-Trafficking Organisation and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. My name's Michael Davidson. I'm First Secretary at the UK mission based here in Vienna. And I'm joined here today by Livia Wagner, Christina Ammerhauser, Maria Ajlikovic, Tomislav Rameljak, and Virginia Kiddle, each of whom have excellent presentations to deliver to you today. So we're going to hear 4 presentations today, and then there'll be time for an open Q&A at the end, a questions and answers section. But first, I would ask if I could say a few words. So, like many countries, the UK believes that it's vital that civil society is able to engage with member states at the UN. And I'm positive that this event will demonstrate the value of this kind of engagement. The UK is delighted to be hosting the event, which gives local civil society a voice here at the CCPCJ, which is an important UN forum. So let me say a little bit about each of the organisations here today, as I've been particularly impressed with the important work that they are doing. So let me start with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, which is a great partner of the UK, and particularly its observatory of illicit economies in southern Eastern Europe. The GI Observatory provides an important platform for civil society in the fight against organised crime, and in essence, it gives a voice to those most affected by these criminals. Criminals who are too used to operating in silence and being protected by fear. As such, the observatory has produced a number of important reports, which I'd encourage everybody to have a look at. They're on the website, focusing on issues that are important to our work here and vital to individuals and people in the region. I can particularly commend the recent Infrastructure of Integrity series that focused on corruption and anti-corruption in the Western Balkans, and the third of the Hotspots report, each of which were released in the last few weeks, but the Hotspots reports in particular are definitely worth a look. I've read all 3 and they're all very illuminating. So today we can give impetus to the launch of another report, which focuses on the horrendous crime of commercial sexual exploitation of children. I don't think you need to be a parent to understand that that is a crime against all of our futures, and something that affects children not only in the region, but also around the whole world. So an important issue. The report focuses on the Western Balkans and outlines some the importance of coordinated child protection systems. And for that reason, it's really my pleasure to share this platform with Astra, who are experts in the region as well. Astra is a leading organisation in the Western Balkans. It works to fight against human trafficking, and is another organisation that is giving voice to victims of what we in the UK call modern slavery. And we think that's an apt term because really slavery is probably one of the few concepts that you can equate to what's happening with these people that are being exploited and having their lives taken away from them. As a civil society organisation, Astra continues to shed a light on the worst form of violence against children and is to be strongly commended to us all. In listening to them, I hope that we remember who it is we are working on behalf of, and that we continue to ensure that we work against these horrific crimes. With this, I'll hand over to Christina and Livia, who will give the first report. Please remember to post any questions in the chat. And as I said, there'll be 4 presentations, and then we'll be able to have a question and answer session. So thank you very much again for attending. I hope that you listen intently. It helps us to all work in a better and stronger and more collaborative way. So I'll hand over now to Livia and Christina, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this kind introduction. And we're very pleased to be here today. My name is Livia Wagner. We're the team from the Global Initiative, and we're very happy to see so many familiar faces from the people that we have been working through the last year on this report. So today we're going to present the report Exploitation in Plain Sight, which is an assessment of commercial sexual exploitation of children and child protection responses in the Western Balkans. For this report, we worked with 15 researchers affiliated with civil society organizations across the Western Balkan 6 countries to unveil this horrendous crime against children. And as Michael was saying, commercial sexual exploitation of children is something that is not happening only in the Western Balkans, but sadly around the world. And we're talking here about violence against children, sometimes toddlers. And I think this is something that we really have to remember, that we're talking here about numbers, we're talking about legal frameworks, but at the end, we're talking about children being exploited at the moment as we speak. And in addition to the report, we are also launching an analysis for legal practitioners where we have been looking at commercial sexual related provisions, where these provisions are located, and also a comparison of the penalties across the 6 countries. So could we have the first slide, please? Today we're going to give you a presentation, or starting to give you an overview of the findings from this report. And we're going to start with a look at the global commercial sexual phenomenon around the world. Just a second. So we're going to start with with an overview of the global phenomenon of commercial sexual exploitation of children, then look into a bit the methodology for this report, the focus areas in the Western Balkan countries, and then looking at the current responses from the child protection system. When we're talking about the global phenomenon of tech-facilitated exploitation and exploitation in the travel and tourism, I'll just hand over, so if you need to add people in. What we are looking at, we're looking basically at 2 areas. So the first area is the tech-facilitated exploitation of children, or online exploitation of children, and then at exploitation in the travel and tourism sector. When looking at the tech-facilitated exploitation, we are talking here, to put this in numbers, we're talking about 750,000 perpetrators worldwide at any given time. Only in 2018, 45 million child abusive material that includes videos and images were reported. And according to the European Commission, the reports on commercial sexual exploitation quadrupled from 1 million in 2019 to 4.1 million in 2020. There was an impact on COVID to this phenomenon, which my colleague is going to address further. But what we want to highlight here is that technology plays a crucial role at every stage of the process of commercial sexual exploitation of children. So we're talking about member-only dark web forums, for instance, and encrypted communication platform where traffickers are exchanging information. Children are being groomed at social media platforms such as Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat. Girls and minors are being coerced at other communication platforms like, for instance, Skype, or online games as well. And these illicit activities are then being live streamed, recorded, or stored, for instance, in cloud applications like Dropbox, online, Google Drive, OneDrive, and so forth. And then, of course, further being distributed via peer-to-peer networks in the open, but also, of course, in the dark web. And also traffickers advertise their victims on escort services. And here we have to see that by addressing, or by looking at the role of technology, it's also important that the responses are adequate and there are enough tech resources available. The second area that we have been looking at is also sexual exploitation of children in the travel and tourism sector, which is a little bit more known because this is also something that organizations have been working on for the last 30 years at least. And when we're talking, which is another manifestation now of sexual exploitation of children, and when we're talking about the travel and tourism industry, we're talking about the use of accommodation, of transportation, and other tourism-related services. And exploitation in the travel and tourism sector involves the exchange of cash, but also food and clothes, or some other form of consideration to a child for a sexual contact. The offenders are, or the potential offenders are mainly classified in two groups, which are the traffickers that recruit children, but to exploit them for a monetary gain, and then also the purchasers of sexual exploitation, who can be domestic travelers, but also international tourists. The challenge here, like in the other areas as well, is that there is a lack of aggregated data. So there is an estimation that only in Europe, there are 1.14 million people being exploited in the hospitality industry. That includes sexual exploitation, but also, as we will hear, there is always an overlap, or very often an overlap, between sexual exploitation and other forms of exploitation. And the hospitality industry plays a very central role here, as their awareness is crucial to also address this more effectively. But we're also talking about, as I was saying, about the transportation services or transportation industry, accommodation, and including hotels, motels, but also online rental services like Airbnb. And the industry has come together to develop the code, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative that was initiated by the private sector and Egbert to train staff from hotel and other industry sectors from that area to be more aware on and to identify and detect exploitation of children. I think I'll hand over here now to my colleague, Christina.
Thank you very much, Livia. I just quickly want to present the methodology now, and then go into the more details of the report, especially on the Western Balkans. So, as we said, the purpose of the report is to assess children's vulnerability to commercial sexual exploitation in the Western Balkans. And so we looked at the phenomenon really from a cross-regional perspective, its prevalence, who is exploited, who are the perpetrators, and focused specifically on the child protection system. We started this process more or less a year ago with a literature review. Field research, interviews took place towards the end of last year in November, December, and even in January 2021. And then we had a drafting, validation of information period, and an expert group meeting in March. I'm very happy to be here today to launch this report. And we worked with civil society, as Livia mentioned, and also from my side, a big thank you again to everybody who contributed and made this report happen. On the focus areas, within the field of human trafficking, we said we focused only on children and primarily on commercial sexual exploitation of children. And commercial sexual exploitation of children manifests itself in various different and interconnected forms in the Western Balkans. This includes exploitation in travel and tourism, tech-facilitated CSEC, recording, live streaming, sharing and downloading of child sex abuse material, child marriage, and trafficking for sexual exploitation. And before we go into more details of the report, it is worth highlighting the risk profile of children. Interviews suggested that they have a similar risk profile among the different forms of commercial sexual exploitation, and it is often based on the socioeconomic circumstances of the family, and children from minorities are particularly vulnerable. Victims include boys and girls, and we also observed changing patterns or new trends in our research, including the vulnerability of children on the move. I also want to highlight and underline again the interlinkages between the different forms of exploitation, especially between labor exploitation and sexual exploitation. For example, children that are forced to beg or work as street vendors are sometimes also forced into sexual exploitation if they don't earn enough money. Our research has revealed the existence of so-called exploitative careers where children that are forced first into begging are then sexually exploited later in bars and brothels. And children that are trafficked for the purpose of child marriage within the region, but also to Western Europe, are also forced into begging and other forms of exploitation. Looking into one of our two focus areas, the sexual exploitation and travel and tourism. I don't want to go into the definition again because Livia covered it earlier, but a couple of things highlighting from a Western Balkans perspective. So commercial sexual exploitation and travel and tourism refers to exploitation by people who travel from their home geographical area, a home country, to other places. This includes domestic and regional travelers and international tourists, but it also includes people who stay for longer periods of time, like expats and volunteers. It's not just this classic form of tourism. And we've taken out a couple of cases, selected examples, and put them on the map on the side. It is important to note that data on exploitation and travel and tourism is really quite limited because most of the cases that happen are either registered as human trafficking cases or as child abuse cases. There's no database or there's no criminal offense really that specifically refers to the exploitation and travel and tourism. Livia mentioned it often includes the use of accommodation, transportation, other tourism-related services. And we know that the tourism industry has grown quite rapidly in the Western Balkans over the last years, with a steady increase of travelers, but new bars, restaurants, hotels, and travel agencies. During our interviews, we noted that there's very little awareness on SEC. The interviews showed that except for international hotel chains, almost no hotels or other tourism-related companies are aware of the risks and vulnerabilities, and they often do not have any protocols to respond or address SEC. There's no exchange with civil society on the matter, and the police do not update civil society or private enterprises on current trends. And there are actually only very few that have signed this code of conduct, this multi-stakeholder approach in the region. And there are some countries where no company, no hotel has signed the code of conduct. When it comes to tech-facilitated exploitation, interviewees stated that it's either already a challenge or it is really becoming a growing phenomenon. But also here, there's very little data available and reliable statistics on national CSEC or tech-facilitated CSEC. We found that there's no systematic approach across the region of monitoring trends, except for isolated case studies, which don't fully represent the data as it's mostly collated through qualitative means. And there's no reporting mechanism specifically addressing tech-facilitated CSEC. When it comes to COVID, we think it's still a little bit too soon to tell the real impact, but generally it is probably fair to say that more children have spent time online over the last years, thereby increasing their vulnerability. The move online makes it more difficult for authorities to identify and rescue victims, and the recruitment that is taking place online also makes it more difficult to identify perpetrators. One last note from point here that we've observed across the region a big gap between actual recorded cases and cases that take place. The awareness of the phenomenon, especially of tech-facilitated CSEC, continues to be low, not least because it is not regularly reported in the media, although we think and we've observed that the knowledge on the topic is growing.
Thanks very much, Christina. We're now moving to the child protection system, as we have been looking and analyzing and comparing like the the 6 countries and their child protection systems. And we have been looking at the similarities, the challenges, and the gaps here. And when looking at the child protection system at the bottom, or not at the bottom, but at the core is the legal framework. So we have been looking at the criminal code here, and all countries, all the 6 countries, they have specific acts on child protection. And most of the countries, they have referring provisions to the Lanzarote and Budapest Convention. And here the challenge is that some countries don't have specific provisions or no separate offenses on tech and travel related issues. So for instance, one country has addressed the exploitation in the travel and tourism under their anti-human trafficking law, and others have it located in the criminal code. So here, what we have seen, and this is what I said before, you can see an overview of this in the practitioner's guide, when you can see also the legal analysis. Looking at the child protection system, we have seen that all the countries, they have strategies, they have national action plans, they have national referral mechanisms, but no country has a unified database on commercial sexual exploitation of children with disaggregated data, which is very important here, or scientific research on tech-facilitated exploitation of children. At the same time, all the countries, they have cybercrime units, but the feedback was that staff are not adequately trained, and that there is a lack of forensic tools and technologies. Countries have reported that they have specialized prosecutors, but this is something that has to be rolled out more across the region. Looking at the intersectoral cooperation between the stakeholders, and that also, of course, includes the private sector, but is looking primarily at law enforcement, judiciary, civil society, and others. The feedback was that the cooperation with international organizations or local civil society organizations exists, but in some countries it's quite limited. And CSOs, they are providing the victim assistance we have here Astra as one representative, but sometimes also international donors, they have to bridge these financial gaps for trainings or for equipment, especially when it's about tech facilitated exploitation. And when looking at the travel and tourism sector here, we have seen that there are varying degrees of expertise and awareness, and that sometimes there is a huge gap between large and smaller companies, and also very few cooperation with NGOs. What we have, I'm just now going to my next slide. When looking at the child protection system challenges or the responses, what we have seen is that there is all the countries, they have signed international and regional instruments. However, sometimes these provisions in the local legal or in the national legal framework are not fully outspelled and reflected. For instance, what all the researchers have claimed is that it's always the term, for instance, child pornography, child prostitution, which is something that has to be changed. As we said, there is the exploitation is addressed in the criminal codes, but sometimes the countries, they have separate criminal offenses related to child exploitation. Then when we're looking at multi-stakeholder coordination and approach, here the issue is, as Christina was also saying, that often a lack of data sharing. And another challenge here is that there is lack of coordinated operationalization of targeted action plans, for instance, between the stakeholders. And here the private sector is increasingly important to address this effectively. When we're looking at the national referral mechanisms, some of them don't have specific or targeted activities. Some of them have, but they don't implement them. And when looking at the law enforcement and the knowledge degree here, we have seen that tech definitely is an issue. It has to be, there has to be more capacity building, more training on technologies, on new trends. And this is something that all the researchers across the 6 countries have expressed their concerns that countries are not up to date for that. What we have also seen is that there is a challenge in providing accommodation and assistance to children on the move and from ethnic minorities as they are at higher risk. I'm going to end our presentation here, and we would like to again express our great thank you to all the researchers that have been involved here, as we feel that this was a very joint effort and would not have been possible without the contribution from the local civil society organizations and independent experts. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm very glad to be here before Astra, and I'm particularly happy to see so many people from the region online, and familiar faces are associates from governmental and non-governmental organizations. I would like to present briefly the role of civil society and child protection from the commercial sexual exploitation of children in the Western Balkans. Civil society movement has a very strong role in Western Balkans for many years now. Non-governmental organizations were first to raise the issue of child sexual exploitation and child trafficking cases. Majority of civil society organizations in Balkans work on this issue on different levels. First, prevention and education, awareness raising, but also many NGOs across the region work as service providers for child victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, providing medical, legal, psychological support, running shelters and SOS hotlines to support victims, and not rarely working 24/7. In the last 20 years, many positive changes have happened in the region when CSOs advocated for adopting the national legal and policy frameworks. Also, together with the governments, they built national referral mechanisms and developed services for child victims, like shelters, developed methodology and established SOS hotlines, developed specialized recovery, alternative education, and other integration programs for child victims of sexual exploitation and trafficking. As main challenges working on this, civil society organizations define several things, and you can read it through the report as well. First of all, lack of implementation of the existing legal and institutional framework, like my colleagues previously said. As it was stated in the recent Constitutional Court decision of the Republic of Serbia in March this year, existence of the laws and mechanisms per se is not enough, but implementation is necessary in order to prevent and protect victims of trafficking and sexual exploitation. Second, the lack of indicators for identification of victims leads to problem with data collection, which is an issue in almost all countries of the Balkan region, but also the consequence is failure to assist child in need. So the dark number of non-recognized victims still remain very high in the Balkan region. The third is lack of proactive investigation, which leads us to small number of cases in the court, but also it means using a child as a main witness during the trial. That very often means that children need to repeat their stories several times before the end of the process, which brings us to the re-traumatization of child victims through the system. Speaking then on protection, particularly in judiciary procedure, victims are facing their abusers. The video links and other technical possibilities in the law are not actually used in the practice very often. Compensation is almost never granted to victims, and compensation funds for victims of violent criminal acts exist only in several countries of the region. Lack of services specialized for children, particularly shelters, urgent accommodation, and specialized reintegration programs is a burning issue in the whole region. Long-term reintegration and economic empowerment is very weak. And last but not least, many NGOs stated that cooperation with government institutions also could be improved. What I want to say is actually that the power of the civil society organizations in the Western Balkan region is first of all experience and field work, but also long-term networking and close connection of civil society organizations in the region and worldwide. However, the capacities of NGOs dealing with this phenomenon remain low, meaning that they or we have unsustainable services due to the lack of funding. Still, majority of NGOs in Balkan region are supported by donors, foundations, UN and EU agencies. Not many governments in the region allocate funds from the state budget to support the civil society organization work. Even many of them are licensed and their services actually are standardized in line with the government requirements. So this brings us to the main recommendations actually regarding civil society organizations. First, it is important to ensure that civil society and NGOs' participation in policy drafting and decision-making process. Second, cooperation between government institutions and NGOs must be improved at least through signing the memorandums of cooperation, which will be used as a base for further improving of cooperation. Donor community needs to understand the importance of unrestricted funds for civil society organizations in Balkan region that could be used for direct victim assistance and building capacities of CSOs. Helpline and hotline mechanisms for the reporting of inappropriate content and support to victims should be strengthened and financially supported by the government, ensuring anonymity and protection of personal data of victims. Then further on, victim assistance such as accommodation, psychosocial, legal help, forensics, and further assistance should be tailored for children needs to enable them to fully recover and reintegrate into their communities. We should also pay special attention to particularly vulnerable children from Roma, refugee, and migrant community. It is very important to establish a fund to provide compensation to child victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, and to intensify efforts to confiscate assets that were acquired through these acts and use them to develop services for victims and not for some other purposes. Also, it is very, and I will end up with this. It is very important to establish the independent monitoring mechanism like ombudsman or national rapporteur on this issue. And I will misuse here my position and say about positive development in this sense in Serbia, which will most probably happen if we adopt a new draft law on the protection of citizens, which will now have one extra role, and that is the role of national rapporteur for trafficking and sexual abuse of children and people. So I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for the important work that you're doing. As I said at the beginning, the UK very much supports an active civil society as the bridge between government and victims. So, yeah, thank you very much for this presentation on the role of civil society. We'll now go over to Tomislav Rameljak, who will talk about the role of technology, which was something that was highlighted by the excellent presentation at the beginning from our colleagues from Global Initiative. So I'm interested to hear more. Thank you, Tomislav.
Thank you, and greetings from Croatia. It was a real privilege and honor to work with Livia and Christina with this great project. So I write down a lot of interesting things listening to these presentations, but mainly I think it's necessary to go back a little bit and to understand why the problem of the CSAM to the internet and expanding the CSAM in the last few years is important. As acknowledged by many researchers, around 1% of male population had sexual urge to children. So it's a huge, let's say, market area. Development of dark web and Bitcoin, digital money, the CSAM problem all over the world exploded. In this report, it was good to compare, for example, Croatia, the country where I worked from, as a court expert and the executive director of the NGO called Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who we are working last 15 years in protection of the children of online. And we also are running Safer Internet Center here in Croatia to compare with the other countries in Western Balkans. And the problem is the same in all other countries. Also in Croatia, it's not much better situation, although we are the member of EU from 2013, and we signed all protocols regarding Budapest Convention, Lazarus Convention, and everything. But in theory, all is good on paper, but in practice, it's completely different story. Regarding of this report, we have found a lot of interesting things, and it was really interesting to see all answers and doing the research. The main problem is, and you can see in the report, as I said, three pillars. First, the staff. There's not enough staff who are dealing and who are expertise doing the CSAM evidence to remove the forensic evidence from the computers, from the phones and cameras. There are no prosecutors who are experts in this kind of field, and I think that the main problem also is judges. I think there are also no expert judges in these fields. So a lot of problem comes that convictions, I think, from those cases are very low. So this is the problem that we also need to understand. The problem of the equipment and the staff not be trained regularly educated, and also the license they are doing the forensic from the computers and the phone is very big, because the information and the system problem is changing, I say, on daily basis, and the training equipment must be regularly renewed, and the training must be held, as I said, also on very more often basis than it is right now. So I think that for report of the Western Balkans report is for conclusion that it must be regional hub of experts that will provide equipment for software forensic and training for police officer, for prosecutors, and for the judges. I think that if police officers don't have software, don't have training, they cannot do digital forensic of the equipment they take from offenders. So I believe that is one of the key elements if we want to move forward in fighting the CSAM online.
Thank you very much, Tomislav. You know, it's very tempting for us civil servants to feel that we know everything, but it's always good to be reminded that we very much don't. And I think that's very much the case when it comes to the online world. And I think you've clearly explained there why it's important that we have education on online issues, but also that education spreads throughout the entire system. So thank you very much for your presentation. I'm going to hand over now to Virginia, who's part of our National Crime Agency and an expert, therefore, on law enforcement and international best practice. So you're very welcome. Thank you very much for being here, Virginia, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to spend a very short amount of time discussing how the UK has attempted to tackle sexual exploitation of children from both a domestic and an international perspective. There can be no doubt that commercial sexual exploitation of children is a multifaceted and very complicated landscape. And I'd like to thank Global Initiative for highlighting the area of law enforcement, which is so key in tackling this worldwide problem. Perhaps the main and hardest question for law enforcement is, how do we manage the risk when all of the risks are so high? What do we prioritise? Are we looking to prioritise the prevention of the offence, the protection of children, or the pursuit of offenders? And trying to balance all of those different priorities is very difficult. We look to ask ourselves questions about how we interact with the victims, their families, and the communities in which they belong, which is not always easy. And equally, how do we manage the human rights of the suspects and the offenders that we deal with? Another important issue for us. Unfortunately, the UK has many examples of where improvements were required. For us, it's been a long process to get to the stage we're at now, and has taken us decades to reach where we are. I guess in attempting to describe our approach, I've distilled our system into three Ps, which comes to policies, partnerships, and professional judgment. Much of the UK's strategic direction of dealing with child sexual abuse has come from our work instilling policies as a country and within the international framework. This has been as a result of many serious case reviews, particularly where there's been large-scale child sexual abuse or the very tragic deaths of children. We've also moved into areas where we're looking at long-term inquiries, and many of the UK's child protection principles have been recently examined in the Independent Inquiry on Child Sexual Abuse, or ICSA, you may have heard of. And this inquiry has looked at the failure of organisations and agencies to protect children, and particularly in areas where they've already been subject to inquiry. Perhaps the key point is that we can never take our eye off the ball. As Tomislav has highlighted, you know, there are so many advancements in technology. It's a constant battle for us to keep up, and we need to keep those areas under review for the long term. The UK has consolidated all of these points in a national strategy, and the Tackling Child Sexual Abuse strategy was released this January and is available online. It affects all government departments, whether this be law enforcement, foreign relations, development agencies, social welfare, education. It's really a broad policy, and consolidates how all of those government agencies within the UK are going to act together and not in silos to prevent this very serious issue. I guess the key points to take away from the UK's policies are that it's been a road of recognising the errors at all stages of child protection, and a process to create the will to address these issues and to keep them under continual review. It's a recognition that child sexual exploitation and other areas of child sexual abuse overlap many areas, and the only way that we can address these is by working together. Which brings me nicely onto partnerships. The UK has really had to consider how well organisations and agencies work together and where this can be improved. And we've regularly sought to exploit multiple areas. So where can the law enforcement side of the UK work with key partners? And we have looked at the private sector, particularly social media companies. How can we work together to prevent child sexual exploitation? Working with academia, what are the psychological makeups of offenders? How can we stop them on the road before they get to the offline offending and the online offending? We ask ourselves, how can law enforcement work with cross-government departments and other agencies? The last 20 years have seen the UK develop a multi-agency approach, and some of the previous speakers have touched on how important this is and where we can work together, for example, in special prosecution units to combat this particular area. Of course, this doesn't just happen in the UK, it has a wide international aspect. So how do we as law enforcement officers work in this landscape? And this is by making use of the best partnerships that we have in terms of using Interpol and Europol resources. We work with our colleagues in international missions and NGOs and other charities and organisations across the world to enhance our picture of what is happening in the child sexual exploitation arena. And as has also been touched on by other speakers, we use international legislation, and there are very sort of key elements within the UK legal framework that allow us to prosecute offenders that may have offended overseas but are now back in the UK, and that's been a really important area for the UK to develop and focus on, and we've had a number of successes in that area. We've also been able to make use of mutual legal assistance frameworks, as well as police-to-police inquiry. So bringing together the law enforcement community from a global perspective, not just from a UK one. I think perhaps I'll finish with the key area that law enforcement should focus on, and that's professional judgment. Many of the UK inquiries and reviews have highlighted a culture of non-reporting, and it's really important that officers feel empowered to ask those difficult questions and encourage others to report. And the UK has had some success with this in terms of social media campaigns, outreach activities, and the publication of the successes that we've had in terms of dealing with offenders. But our focus really remains on safeguarding the victims, and the last few decades have seen the UK move towards more victim-focused investigations. How do we best care for the victims of child sexual abuse? And considering, and this is a hard area for law enforcement, but what is the best result for a victim? And this may not lie within the criminal justice system. If a victim can interact with law enforcement and come out of that with a positive perspective, that may be the best result that we can achieve. And as I touched on earlier in the discussion, overlaying all these considerations are human rights. We talk a lot about the human rights of the children, but law enforcement must also consider the human rights of the suspect, and how do we make best use of our strategies? For example, suicide prevention, arrest strategies is another key factor for us to think of. So it's a whistle-stop tour of what the UK law enforcement perspective has been, and it's I could talk all day on this subject, but I will keep it short and sweet, and I look forward to any questions in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Virginia. I think that brings us to the end of all the presentations, and thank you for ending on a note which is about the victims. I think what we've seen through all of the presentations is a kind of breakdown of the issue. So colleagues from Global Initiative showed us the size of the problem and how it's multifaceted. Our colleague Maria from Astra showed us how to engage with victims on the ground and how to work on their behalf. Tomislav showed us some of the challenges that the system has in linking in with those victims. And then we've tried to show the journey from the UK, where we've been through this process of learning that actually you can have all the law enforcement in the world, but if you get the focus wrong, if you forget that it's about the children themselves, then you risk re-traumatizing them, as Maria has rightly pointed out. It's now time for a Q&A. You can put your questions in the chat. I know that it's quite nerve-wracking to speak in this format, so please feel free to just put any questions you have there. I have one of my own, and I know that there's one already. So let me go to the one that's been asked first by Marie. And she says, as a student, I'd love to know what information you could get from literature and what information we get from field research. So maybe that's one for the team at Global Initiative. Yeah, let's go over to you, and then I'll ask a question myself to Maria. Yeah,
thanks very much for that question. And that was actually one of the challenges we were facing when looking at the phenomenon in the region, because there are not many, but there are some reports from international organizations like UNICEF, like ECPAT, like Save the Children, with some numbers, but some of these numbers are already outdated. Just UNICEF and Save the Children, they have more recent ones, but there are no reports about the regional phenomenon, and there are no reports about the specifics when it's about the exploitation of children or the vulnerabilities of children. So that was the reason why we decided to work with local experts and local civil society organizations, because we knew that the data is not enough for us to get like a vision of what is happening on the ground. So and when looking at the feedback from the researchers and through the interviews that they had, some of our researchers had close to 100 interviews. So the feedback also was very interesting, because looking at, for instance, stakeholders, interviewing law enforcement, there were also sometimes conflicting information, because one representative said, for instance, yeah, we have enough capacities, we have enough sources of resources to tackle the issue, and others said, no, we actually don't have enough resources and we need capacity building and so on. So that's the reason why it's always important to add this qualitative research in addition to the quantitative.
Thanks very much, Livia. And may I also ask, is there a kind of document that also provides a legal analysis? Because I guess that would also be interesting for academia.
Well, there are from the Commission, from the European Commission, there are some comparisons, and from the different, from the Council of Europe, there are some comparisons, but of course not all the countries are referred in these comparisons or in these assessments. So what we did is, of course, with together with the local researchers, is we were looking at the specific legal frameworks, and they were providing all the provisions that were related or are related to sexual exploitation of children. So unfortunately, there is not something like an in-depth legal analysis yet, and for that, so that's why we thought that this might be very useful for legal practitioners and other people being interested in that topic.
Thank you very much. I see that there's a follow-up question from Marie where she asks if there's any areas that we would need more academic research, and I guess the legal analysis, as you just pointed out, is one of those areas. So Marie, if you're online, please look into that area, and we expect the report for next year. No, I'm joking, but I think it's good to, that would be a good start. Let me move on to Maria from Astra and just ask one last question from me. You talk about in Serbia where you've had this additional piece of legislation, you're able to work together as the rapporteur to ensure that the voices of victims are heard. Can you tell us a little bit more about how civil society supports the enhanced cooperation with the private sector and also with law enforcement, and what you think we might want to improve there?
Mm-hmm. The Institute of National Rapporteur on Trafficking is still not in place, but it is in the draft law that soon need to be adopted, we hope, and that would be the new role of our ombudsman, actually, to monitor the trafficking situation in Serbia and position and the rights of the victims. And speaking about the relation between civil society organizations and other sectors, I must say, I mean, ironically, but communication and cooperation between NGOs and governmental institutions are on much higher level than communication between civil society organization and private sector, which is something very new that we are entering to. So we only recently start to communicate and to exchange experience and challenges with the private sector. But in the last 20 years, we managed to establish very good cooperation with the law enforcement, with the social services, with institutions who also are part of the national referral mechanism. What we need is actually fine-tuning, you know, in every particular case. We need maybe better coordination of the activities, and particularly in identification and assistance. But we have many good examples of good cooperation and actually common work on the common cases, you know, which result in positive sense. And I really hope we will continue in that way. I mean, after 20 years, it's normal somehow to have this, you know.
Well, I don't think it's normal. I think it's commendable. So thank you very much for your answer. I think if there are no more questions in the chat, maybe we will wrap up the event there. I would just like to say a big thank you to everybody who presented. There's such a wealth of experience amongst those that presented, decades of experience on these issues. And I think we've all benefited from your experience today. For me personally, I will go away and think about how we at the UN can help to support your work through discussions like these or through coordinated international action. Let's end on a logistical note. There's a very good question from Shannon. When and where will the recording be available? That's maybe for Global Initiative.
Yeah, the recording will be available later today on the Global Initiative website and then on the YouTube channel.
Great, thank you very much. So Global Initiative YouTube channel, I guess if you Google that, then you'll be in the right place. Well, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you everybody who presented, and let's continue our work collectively on this really important issue that, as I said, affects our future. Yeah, very impressed by the presentations, and yeah, hopefully we can do more. Thank you.